I'm Billy Abbott, the Whisky Exchange Ambassador, and for this Meet the Maker video, I'm joined by writer, historian, whisky industry veteran, whisky marketer, whisky educator, and now author and commentator, talking and writing about the whisky world, Nicholas Morgan. Now, Nick, hello, how are you doing?
Very well, Billy. Nice to have a chat with you again.
Excellent. So, before we dive into your new book, I just want to sort of pick up a little bit on your background. So, how did you get into the wonderful world of whisky?
Well, I think like many people, by accident, really. In the new book, I describe myself as being like a guest at Christmas who outstayed his welcome. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I was teaching history actually at Glasgow University in the Scottish History Department, and I'd been away doing a sabbatical, working on a project about the building structure and development of the city in the late 19th century. And I came back at the start of the next term to something that most people won't recognize these days, but it was a huge pile of correspondence, right? All those letters and things that people used to write you. And in there was a letter inviting me to go to a company called United Distillers to be interviewed for a post of archivist, which they had just created out of the sort of debris from the Guinness merger with the Distillers Company that had happened a couple of years earlier. And I went along for the interview and I got the job, which was great, very exciting, big challenge. And having been archivist at United Distillers for 3 or 4 years, I somehow swerved into marketing. And when Diageo was formed, I was given the job of marketing director for their malt whiskey portfolio. So I was managing the biggest selection of malt whiskies in the world, and we introduced special releases and all that sort of stuff. And then I moved on into a communications role before I retired at the end of last year. That's it, short version.
Yeah, and having known you for a few years, there's many bits in a communications role, maybe doing that bit down a little bit. Sort of person who spoke most about Diageo's whiskey, sort of like more than anybody else. But that led into your first whiskey book project.
Well, no, I'm going to correct you on that in a couple of ways. I am published on whiskey in the past, so I did a couple of things with the sadly recently deceased Michael Moss. We worked very closely together when I was at Glasgow, and we did some things on whiskey marketing, which were published. And I have published stuff that's not about whiskey in the past, if people want to go and try and find some of that. But the book itself actually was long in the making. In Diageo, as I'm sure in most companies, there's a sort of annual review process, and part of that annual review process, you are asked to state what your ambition is. And I'm not really a person of great ambition, broadly speaking, but for about 15 years, I'd simply been putting in that space that what I wanted to do was write the history of Johnnie Walker for the bicentenary in 2020. So I, in the end, was supported in that, which is very kind of Diageo, and we started work on it in about the end of 2017, and it was published duly in October last year.
Indeed, and yeah, it's a very good book. I very much enjoyed it. But so after the book was published, you then retired from Diageo?
Yeah. I retired at the end of December. And by that time, actually, I'd already been approached by Sukhinder Singh and one of his colleagues to ask me if I'd be interested in taking up the project for this new book. And Diageo were kind enough to agree to let me start working on it, because I was only working half-time for my last 6 months at Diageo. So in theory, I was going to spend half of the time working on the sort of final bits of the Johnnie Walker book and getting it out there and promoting it. Of course, COVID sort of put an end to most of that. And then the other half, I was supposed to be beginning work on the new book. But sadly, Diageo was a bit more demanding than I'd anticipated. So I didn't really start on the new book, the writing of it, until we were locked down again, at the beginning of this year or whenever that was.
And so speaking of this new book, we have the book now. It's finally we've got our actual copies to actually hold it in reality, and it's Everything You Need to Know About Whiskey, but are too afraid to ask, by you and co-credited with us here at the Whisky Exchange. So how did it all come together? You said that Sukhinder sort of approached you to write it, but what was the idea and how did that all sort of like come together to create this book?
Well, it was an interesting process. So I had a chat with Sukhinder, and he explained his broad vision of what the book might be, which interested me a lot because first of all, I wanted to get a second book under my belt quickly, just to demonstrate to people that that was what I was now sort of doing, And the idea of writing a more general whiskey, so it's not just Scotch whiskey book, it's a book about all whiskies. And I think they're broadly written about in proportion to the global sales of each style of whiskey, which seemed a sort of fair way of doing it. And then I went and talked to the publishers, who are Ebury, part of Penguin Random House. And they had a view of the book, which wasn't entirely aligned with Sukhinder's view. And I was asked to go away and write a book proposal. So my first book proposal was a sort of paragraph, just to try and get people a little interested in it. And then I developed that into a sort of chapter by chapter approach, which everyone seemed very happy with.
So we put the book together now. I've had a read of it, and it's got lots of stuff in there. It covers, as you say, a very, very general book covering across the world of whiskey, with a nice big chunk of Scotch whiskey in there, of course. But who do you feel the book's sort of really aimed at? Who are you trying to reach with that?
So I think it's for anyone and everyone who's sort of curious about the world of whiskey, so it's for, I think, people who might consider themselves to be whiskey experts, who it has to be said might not quite like the chapter on whiskey experts, but that's different point altogether.
I very much enjoyed it from I feel personally attacked, and I feel also that I agree with this. It was, yeah.
So it's for whiskey experts, because actually, and very seriously, there's a lot of stuff in there that people don't know. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there that I didn't know until I came across it. And as you can imagine, to be honest, some of the bits are sort of crumbs from the table of the Johnny Walker book. So there's stuff that just couldn't get into that book about Scotch in general, not Johnny Walker stuff. At the same time, I think it's for people who are just interested in whiskey, but haven't sort of stepped over that barrier of saying, I really want to engage and know more about this. So it does do, this is how whiskey is made. This is about maturation. Very important. This is the glass you're supposed to use, although actually you can use any bloody glass you like, So it covers all of that stuff. The questions people might really have, what glass do I use? How do I drink this? Can I put water in it? All of that stuff. And then it goes on to explore bits that I think are more interesting in some ways because they're a bit different. So it talks about whiskey collecting. There's a whole, which obviously Sukhinder was very keen to have a chapter on that in the book, although he was a bit shocked by the first couple of pages. And then there's a lot about whiskey and culture, whiskey and literature. And then there's a nice piece, I think, about whiskey people, and it just talks about the sort of people that the industry attracts, and talks about some of the people that both Sukhinder and I have worked with, have been lucky enough to know over the past 30 or 40 years, and sort of acknowledges their contribution to the industry. And again, not just Scotch people, but people from all around the world.
One of the things that sort of runs through the book and through a lot of your work is that history of whiskey, looking back in time and seeing where whiskey's come from. Do you feel that's still important to us today, as the whiskey industry is moving on very, very, very quickly and finding new places to go? Should we be looking back as well as forward?
Well, there's a general point here, Billy, that I would make as a trained historian, and I've always sort of used when I've been talking to people about jobs or advising historians looking for jobs, it's a broad point. You don't really know where you're going unless you know where you've been. Think of it like a map. How the hell did we get here? Where are we going to go next? And I think that's really important for any business organization or institution to have a sense of where it's come from, to have a sense of the values that come from that, to have a sense of maybe some of the mistakes that have come from that as well. And I think it's as relevant now at a time when, you know, whiskey around the world is absolutely on fire, you know, unbelievable, because when I joined the industry over 30 years ago, no, I don't think anyone could have imagined a world of whiskey like this. You know, no one could have imagined it. But I think although everyone's sort of shooting away and experimenting and doing this and doing that, you know, a lot of that stuff's actually based on the past. We want, because one of the things I talk about a lot in the book is the fact that so many people who are whiskey enthusiasts and whiskey experts, as it were, are in thrall of this idea of a golden age of whiskey. You know, and that manifests itself in a whole range of different ways. It can be writers talking about something going deeply back into Scottish culture, and it's all about national identity, national pride, independence. Or it can be the people who just go, golden age of whiskey, all the whiskey that was made 40 years ago is much better than it was today. You know, so it works in a number of different levels. So they're all looking to the past. And one of the points I make in the book is that normally the past they're looking to in a classic golden age way is absolutely fictional and absolutely illusory. So one of the things I try and do in the book is debunk some myths, because I think it's important that that should be done. You know, to be honest, most whiskey books simply propagate myths, you know, and continue them. So I wanted to do a bit of myth busting. And certainly that comes into play in this sort of golden age thing. The past is important, but you really need to understand what the past is before you can reference it.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I enjoyed about the book. You know, writing about whiskey myself, I have fallen into that trap of going with the assumed knowledge. Everybody knows this to be true. And there are a few bits and pieces that popped up in the book which was, say, right, knock that off the list. Don't use that one anymore. And I always like it when we get those things, we actually realize where things are actually coming from, and, you know, get more to that sort of that truth of what actually happened.
Yeah, and I think there is I mean, you know, people might look at this book and think it's a bit cynical, but it's not actually, because I'm as passionate and I'm as much in love with whiskey as anyone else. Believe me, I've given my life to Scotch whiskey, you know, and I didn't do that unwillingly. It was just because it's such a fascinating thing to work with, and the people in whiskey are so, whether you like them or not, you know, they're just this crazy bunch of people that come into this industry. So there's passion there, but you have to have knowledge and you have to have understanding. And for me, so much of that starts with history.
So as you're going through the book and researching everything, you know, to bring into it, because you said, you know, this is not just stuff which was stuff you knew already. This was, you know, a book which involved getting out there, finding new things, digging into sort of myths. And so, what's your favorite part to research and write?
Well, I'll tell you, Billy, one of my favorite parts, and one of the things that was most enjoyable, was actually going back and looking at some of these books, some of which I hadn't read for 25 or 30 years. So people like Neil Gunn and Ross Wilson, Robert Bruce Lockhart in particular. I went back and read all of those books, and that was really enlightening in so many ways. And I think the chapter on that covers that area, I hope people will quite enjoy. Something that was new to me was going and looking at the sort of theories behind collecting. And if anyone reads the first couple of pages of that chapter, they'll understand why I was so entertained by doing that. And I could have written a whole chapter just on psychology of collecting, but sadly there wasn't room to do that. And also I would say writing about the whiskey people was nice, because I was able to think about that, trying to do it dispassionately. And I came to realize there are different sorts of people, and how important they all are to the industry, without giving anything away. You know, I think the bit that I'm talking about, and I thought that was quite nice to think about and write. And also I was in touch with a lot of people, and I was certainly put in touch with Jack Milroy, who Sukinder was a great admirer of both Jack and his brother Wallace. And Jack was incredibly helpful and really funny to deal with. So the whole people's, and I phoned up people as well, just in part of doing that chapter, some of whom I hadn't spoken to for a while. So that was the chapter that left me with a bit of a warm feeling. Whether everyone that's in it will feel as warm about it or not, I'm not sure, but we'll see.
Yeah, I remember reading through that, and again, people who I know, who I've met and sort of dealt with, but it sort of dies a little bit, looks people, as you say, dispassionately, but also a little bit differently. It sort of like pulls out different ways of looking at what different people have done through the industry. And I think that's the thing which really sort of comes through in the book, is that you come at this from a very different perspective to many writers. You know, a lot of us, like myself, you know, I came to writing about whiskey from totally outside of the industry, and many people have done that. Where if you come to writing about it after seeing everything from the inside, which is a quite a different view on things.
I think it's really important to have a book like this that's written by someone who, as far as he is able, really understands how the industry works. Because I think very often, even amongst the most informed writers, there's a certain naivety about things. You know, people want to believe things. People in World of Whiskey, those experts and enthusiasts, you know, they desperately want to believe a whole range of things are true, to the point that there's a real cognitive dissonance in play on many issues. I think they just won't believe what really happens. So I think having an industry, a real industry viewpoint, helps on this. And there are some parts of the book. There's a chapter on the business of whiskey, and you know, that's about trying to debunk some myths, because really what people sometimes don't fully understand is that whiskey is a business, and it is about making money. Whether you're big or whether you're the smallest person in it, everyone wants to make money, and that's the most important thing from a business perspective about Scotch. And if you don't understand that, you're really not going to understand many of the things that happen, you know, both in Scotland and all around the world.
So as you say, there's a few bits and pieces in the book which are you sort of turning things on their head, debunking, and sort of like, you know, poking at the industry a bit. Is there any particular sections you're hoping in a spark discussion in the sort of the wider whiskey community?
I think any book about Scotch whisky should provoke discussion and debate. And I suppose if I was being very honest, I would say that many of the books that have been written over the past 10 years or so don't really say anything new. They just repeat everything, and they've got the same old photographs in. You know, the expensive photographer paid to go to Scotland to take the same photographs that were in the last book. So both in terms of the appearance of the book, which is very different for a whiskey book, but certainly in terms of the content, there was a lot in there that was deliberately put in to provoke debate, to provoke thoughtfulness amongst people, you know, trying to have people go look at things with an open mind rather than a closed mind, and to have discussions. You know, it's a sort of book that hopefully people will sit down with a bottle of something really nice that they like, and whatever glasses they like to drink it from, and talk about it and maybe argue about it, but in the friendly way that really governs my sort of theory of debate around Scotch and other whiskies.
Actually, there's already there is pieces in there which you know, I know of several people I sort of mentioned, well, I was reading this book the other day and I read this. What do you think? And it's like, oh, I'm not sure about that. And there are also a number of pieces which at some point in time I will grab you for a chat about. Because already I disagree with a few bits and pieces. But
well, I mean, you know, Billy, what's to say I'm right about everything? You know, I'm just putting stuff out there which people don't normally say. And if they disagree and have another point of view, well, that's fine. You know, that's what debate is all about. And I really, from the point of view of being a historian, and then from the point of view of being a historian of Scotch whisky, history is about debate. It is about discussion. It is about revisionism, so changing views of the past, which I certainly did when I wrote my PhD years ago, which was about the Religious Society of Friends. But I had something in that PhD which said, you know what, guys, you haven't quite understood some of this. So let's think about it again, you know? And I think that's what history books should be. They shouldn't just be repeating the same old stuff all the time, you know? And they should have a point of view. If you haven't got a point of view, There's no reason for writing anything. Why waste your time just saying something that's been said before? So that's why, for example, this isn't a guide to whiskey. I mean, my palate isn't good enough to do the sort of thing that Charlie McLean or Dave Broom do so brilliantly. It's not another list of distilleries, you know, giving them points or stuff like that. Let other people do that. And frankly, it's done to death, really, the list of distilleries. So this is about really getting under the skin of the industry, of the business, of the drink, and the people that work in it. You know, that's what it's about.
And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And as I say, you know, while there's bits where I will use it as an excuse to meet you for a drink and tell you why you're definitely wrong, it's always good to have an excuse. So, so this book's, you know, apart from the fun and games of running around telling people about this one, what's next?
Well, I'm started writing columns for various online outlets, Billy, and I've got a couple of book projects that I'm really trying to get off the ground. But at the moment, it's very difficult to get into some of the archives and libraries, archives in particular, actually, that I need to in order to get some book proposals written. I'm hoping that situation will ease itself over the next couple of months, and then I can get cracking on another book. And you know, to be frankly, I'm a pen for hire as well. If someone's got an interesting project they want to do, and they know sort of how I write about stuff, then I'd be very interested to talk to them.
Thank you very much for having a chat with us today. I wish you all the best of luck with the book, and somewhere around this video there'll be lovely links to find it at the Whisky Exchange, and it's available, I would say, in all good bookshops, but of course, as I work for the Whisky Exchange, it's available from the Whisky Exchange, which is an excellent bookshop as well as an excellent place to buy all your spirits. Anyway, Nick, thanks again for joining us today, and yeah, wish you all the best in finally getting out there and grabbing some more spaces in the archives.
Billy, thanks so much. Really nice to talk.